Hello and welcome. I'm so glad that you're able to join us here. I wanted to talk to you a bit about what's been going on in the world and the fear and how that fear has been impacting the grief journey. For those of you who are in active grief right now, I'm so very sorry for your loss. And I know it's been a very challenging time to be in your grief journey. And for those of you who have loved ones who are grieving and you don't really know how to support them, and you're managing your own fears and you're managing what's happening in the world around you, and you're just looking for a way to support others, thank you so much for your compassionate, gentle heart. Here's the reality about grief. C.S. Lewis, the famous author, in A Grief Observed, said that he never knew grief felt so much like fear. Fear is actually a big component of the grief journey. And what's happening right now is the world is just pumping that fear to us in a myriad of different ways, which is stalling some of us in our grief journey. It's causing us pause. It's causing us to bury and carry something because we just don't even know how to approach it. Most of us have never been taught how to approach the grief journey. And so when we have such losses in our life, we really don't know what to do with it. There's a lot of fear happening in the world, and there's a lot of fear happening in our heart. And so what I know to be true comes from where I've studied, and I'm over a 20-year student with A Course in Miracles. And what I've learned from A Course in Miracles is that fear is a call to love. And certainly the fear of the grief journey, not to mention the fear that has been surrounding us in our grief journey, is a call to love. Can you imagine if the grief journey was honored in a loving way? Can you imagine if we learned a way to actually bring a loving approach to the grief journey? Well, that's really what the Healthy Mourning Revolution is all about, right? We are all about making sure that we revolutionize the way we think about our grief journey. And what we create is compassionate grief communities worldwide, so that if we are the person grieving, we feel the love and support of those around us. And if we are not the person who's grieving, but we know someone who's grieving, we are part of that loving community that can bring compassion and gentleness to anybody's grief journey. In order to do this, we need to learn some fundamental things. And I've broken them down into 5 things that we need to really pay attention to. First of all, we need to get our terminology straight. We bandy about terms like grief and mourning and bereavement, and we use them interchangeably, and we don't necessarily know what those terms mean, and we get locked in those terms. We get overwhelmed by those terms because we think we know what they mean. And most of the time in my practice, I discover that what people come in thinking those terms mean is not the truth of it. And that there's a lot of relief and release that happens simply by gaining some clarity on the terminology. The second thing is we need to do some myth busting, which means there are a lot of good people who are giving misinformation on grief. And if you've been in a grief journey recently, or if you are in one now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. All of the misinformation about you need to seek closure, you need to say goodbye, that your tears are a sign of weakness, all of those myths, time heals the wound of this. This is not the truth. And we're going to explore why this is not the truth of it, because we need to, right? And when we discover what the truth is, we also discover how much we've been carrying around this misinformation, that we have actually believed some of these myths. But the reality is, if we believe a myth that is not true, and our insides, because the grief journey happens on the inside, when our insides meet this fundamental untruth about grief, we start to fight our grief journey, thinking that that's what the journey is, and that our journey is asking us to say goodbye and demanding of us closure, and we're not willing to do it. So we fight it with everything we have. And why wouldn't we? It's not the truth, and our insides know that. Our insides know what's true and fights for what's true. And so the best option becomes to bury and carry if we think that that's what the grief journey is. So learning what the truth is becomes really important here. Surrounding ourselves with people who can be present with us, who are compassionate, loving individuals who can be with us in this grief journey, That's everything. Finding our wellness team is essential. But how do we do that? How do we find our wellness team? How do we vet somebody to discover whether they will be good for us in our journey or whether they're going to be feeding us misinformation from their own places, perhaps, of fear around grief, right? We also will have some really hard questions. Some questions can be answered, and in the answer comes some relief and points the direction of where we need to go next. Some questions are just too hard to answer, and we may never find the answer to those questions, but that doesn't mean that they can't be asked. In fact, they must be asked. They must be articulated out loud. And so finding a safe space where all of our questions can be asked and that a space can be made so that if there is an answer, the answer can be found. Taking the time to do that is essential. And then finally, learning how to truly listen into our inner wisdom so that we hear our next steps and we hear them consistently. And when we get caught up, when we find ourselves tempted to get stalled in our grief journey, or that we're starting to bury and carry and avoid our grief, that we actually know that's what's happening and we find loving ways to approach it. It's all about finding that loving next step. Now, here's the good news. 4 times a year, I do what I call the Healthy Mourning Revolution live launch. The live launch is about me being with you live for 5 days, 1 hour a day. It's only 1 hour a day because this information can be a lot to digest, and we need that full day to really digest the information that's coming up, right? We need to have an opportunity to explore these questions that I've been asking, right? And so day 1 is all about getting clear on our terminology. Day 2 is about finding what those myths are and identifying the ones that we have identified with, and then discovering what the truth is underneath the myth, because every myth is born of some underlying truth. So we need to honor the truth underneath the myth before we can release ourselves of the burden of the myth. 3rd day is all about learning how to vet people around us so that we surround ourselves with truly loving, compassionate people, and we create for ourselves a compassionate grief community. Until such time as everybody in our community learns how to walk with grief and is comfortable doing so, we're going to need to make choices about who we allow in, because we only have limited amounts of energy when we're in a grief journey. And we need to make sure that we're expending that energy well and wisely. Day number 4 is all about questions. It's a space that I make that entire hour. All week long, we collect your questions and then we put them into a Q&A sheet. And I just go from question to question where there's a question that I can answer and I can give some support and some insight, then I'm happy to do so. And if the question is a question that needs to be answered for oneself, then we explore that as well. And we explore how might we take the next steps towards this question. Day 4 is always quite a big day, and often it's so big it overloads the hour. In that case, what we do is we create some bonus sessions. And so keep your weekend free if that is something you're able to do for those bonus sessions. But here's the thing. If you're not available to be with us live, that's not an issue. We tape every session. Sessions happen on Zoom. We have a classroom where we collect all of the Zooms, and you can go into the classroom. You can upload your homework if you feel comfortable to do so. Believe me, it's worth it to upload your homework because there are prizes. There's a draw for everybody who does their homework. And the reason we do this is because we know that that's encouragement for you to actually take the material that we're talking about and dig deep with it and find your own truth. This is not about me giving you wisdom. This is about you learning to hear your inner wisdom. You're learning to hear your fundamental truth. And when we do that and we do that successfully, then you're well on your way to launching your grief journey in ways that can happen with ease and grace. Day number 5 is all about really celebrating that we do know how to hear our next loving step, that we really do know how to take that loving step and commit to it, and that we even know what to do if we're feeling a little stuck or if we find ourselves avoiding our grief a little bit. We learn how to bring love into the sphere place of grief, and with it, we get to walk through the grief journey with ease and grace, and even with a bit of joy. Because here's the thing, St. Francis of Assisi knew that joy is not happiness, and that joy can be found in even the most challenging of human experiences, and grief is the most challenging of human experiences. The grief journey is about discovering where the relationship with your loved one is now. Every day of my practice, I use this quote: death ends a life, not a relationship. Mitch Albom used the quote, quoting his teacher, Maury Schwartz, in his book, Tuesdays with Maury. And it's a fundamental wisdom that says that the death of our loved one ended their life. And part of our grief journey is for sure to reconcile with the reality that physically they are no longer with us. And yet we can't do that if we can't find where the relationship is now. Finding where the relationship is now ensures that we really do get to the other side of the grief journey, and that we find a way to step into our life again with ease, with grace, and even with joy. So join us on the inside. You'll see the description of the next live launch. Please register for it and learn about these essential 5, because this is what will set you up to really walk through your grief journey in a way that honors you, honors your loved one, and honors your community. Your community may want you to become the person you were before, and you may even want that for yourself as well. But the reality is, death changes us. Our grief journey is there to be a gentle guide as we transform into the person we are yet to become, one that honors and remembers, and one that steps forward into life with joy. I look forward to seeing you on the inside. Until then, namaste.